We've talked about our big vision and the scope of what we're going to do, but we're going to spend some time now talking about how you break that down a little bit and think about the targets, the things you care about, how healthy they are, and how you use that to think about goals. This Adaptive Management for Conservation training program is supported by UNDP with GEF financing. It's delivered by Conservation Management and Community Solutions in partnerships with the Blue Mountains World Heritage Institute. The source material is used under a Creative Commons licensing based on original materials developed by the Conservation Measures Partnership and Protected Area Solutions. So, in terms of our planning process, we're still in the assess part of the process, but we now have moved on from thinking about scope and vision, and we're thinking about targets. So when we're talking about targets, what do we mean? Sometimes these are called things like assets or values, but what we're really talking about are the important things that make country healthy. Why do we do this step? It's to really help people focus on what are the important things to look after. And that really helps you think about what you're going to focus most of your time and effort on. So without coming up with some targets and some specific things to focus on, it will be a lot harder to put your plan into action and a lot harder to see if you think it's working. When we're thinking about targets, especially when we're thinking about protected areas, we often think about things like ecological systems or ecological communities and species, and we will be thinking about those. But we'll also be thinking about some of the human well-being aspects that you might want to consider. So the non-biological, things that are social or economic or cultural, and we'll touch on cultural in the next slide. And we really encourage you to take a fairly holistic view of your planning, so you don't need to treat these things separately. We can really think about them together. When we're thinking about cultural targets, they might include things like culture and stories, customary law systems, traditions, etc. The other thing that we find, particularly working with traditional owners in Australia, is many targets are actually natural and cultural and potentially even economic together. So we can really link those targets together. We can look at the connections between things. When you use the open standards for conservation, there are two different ways to include human wellbeing targets and cultural targets. Some people like to separate them from ecological targets, and some people like to group them together. In this course, we'll be working with you. We'll generally be assuming that you'll keep those targets together rather than separating them out, given the fact that you're working with local communities, and that's likely to be a more comfortable way for them of working. We've got a slide here just outlining some of the targets from one of our healthy country plans in northern New South Wales. So it includes things like the law and culture, right way fire, kangaroos and wallabies, some of the meat animals, rock art, and then some of the marine animals as well, so turtles and dugong. When we're selecting our targets, this is often a little bit of an iterative process, so we can really start thinking about a big set of things and then thinking about how to group them together. Usually we get groups to think about all the different things that are most important, and some of this, when you're working with your protected area guidelines, will come out in the story, our story part of the discussion. You'll probably end up with a pretty long list of things that people care about, but to make the plan manageable and so that you can actually practically use the plan, we want to end up with a list of about 8 to 10 targets. So how do we do that? We usually try and lump things together or group things together, and we do that by already thinking about, what can be managed together. then we think about the things that might have very particular requirements. So if you've got a forest ecosystem and you've got a lot of animals that live in that forest ecosystem, if you can manage those together, you might think about it as the forest system and associated animals. You might separate something out if by looking after the forest system you're not going to look after that particular species. So often might have a particular threat or a particular problem for that species, and that might mean you want to look at it a little bit separately. But the thing we really focus on is think about all the things you're interested in and then think about how you can group them together. Sometimes it really helps to think about your targets and also to think about how you group them together is to map them. Again, I know this is a technique and participatory mapping is a technique that's been used in Papua New Guinea for a long time, but we really find it helps people think about their country when they can draw it. So it can be a technical map. You could, be very technical and use GIS, or you can use the much more participatory pictorial techniques that people at a community level are comfortable with. So when we're thinking, and we'll sort of come back to this idea of joining or separating targets, lumping or splitting, we want you to look at your long list and see if you can join things together. And we generally suggest that you lump them if they occur in the same sort of place, if they require similar processes, so particularly similar ecological processes, the same type of water regime or the same type of fire regime, things might go together. We also, if you want to keep them together, you probably want them to have a fairly similar sort of health ranking. And sometimes you'll find that one target actually can serve as a pretty good indicator for the other, and that means it's a good thing to think about them together. The other little test that you can do is think about, do they have similar things that are threatening them? And all of that adds up to really thinking about the management that you're going to do. So if there's in the similar places, if they've got similar health, and if they've got similar threats, then you're going to use similar management, but you might separate them if you're going to need different management. So with the open standards, we're often doing a little bit of thinking forward a couple of steps. So in this case, we're starting to already think forward, what sorts of threats are there, what sorts of strategies or actions might we use, but we're using that to help us think about how we group stuff together. This is what we call a nested example. So we talked about the fact you might come up with quite a long list of things when you're first working with the community. And so you don't necessarily lose the sense of all the things that you want to include in your target. We just suggest that what you do is when you're talking about the target, make a list, and we sort of say they're nested. They're all sort of kept together. So that's one way of, I guess, particularly when you're working with communities, making sure you recognise the things that are important for them and give them a home, but also in terms of the planning and implementation and monitoring process, you're still working with a manageable number of things that you're going to focus on in your plan. One thing we find is the way you think about targets will often change as you work on them. So in your first list, you might have really decided to focus on a particular type of bird. After looking at the threats, you might have said, no, we can think about that in the context of the forest environment it lives in. And then by the time you get to the plan, you might have thought about it some more and said, look, we really need to look after that forest type. But actually, when we're thinking about that, the other thing we need to keep in mind is this kangaroo. So it's okay for things to change a bit over time, but it's really about sort of trying to come up with the best grouping you can with the current information. And then we'll keep talking to you through the course about just maintaining that flexibility. If things aren't working or you've got new information and you want to change things, being able to change and adapt and sort of keep going. So we had a look and you'll start to see examples from Lake Katubu as we go through all of these slides. We just had a bit of a look to see, well, what sort of targets have people come up with in previous consultations that have been used to put some of the draft statements of management intent together. So you can see here one of the drawings from the initial planning session, and that was sort of separated into a list of plants, animals, endemic fish were pulled out specifically, fresh water, and particularly fresh drinking water and usable drinking water, and then culture and tradition. Once we've got that list of targets and we've given some thought about how to group them, one of the next steps we do is we really try and think about their target health. This is sometimes called viability. Why do we do this step? It's really so that we can be a lot clearer about what makes the target healthy, so that we're able to measure that, and so we can really tell whether all the things we're doing in our plan are working in terms of looking after our national parks or our reserves. So it takes a bit of time and organisation to do this step, and it often needs you to come back and relook at the information you've got, but doing some work here really helps make the next steps easier and much more focused. There's 4 steps in the analysis: selecting attributes, identifying indicators for the attributes, doing a rating, so making a rating scheme for those attributes, and assigning a current status. So selecting attributes. Attributes are really the characteristics of the target. So when we're thinking about that, they're the things about the target that if they're significantly changed, would see the target being unhealthy or perhaps actually shift it to something quite different. So some examples or ways to think about attributes. It might be the size, so the area of a target or the abundance of a target. It might be the condition, so native species versus introduced species. The structure of a forest, does it have its ground layer, mid layer and top layer? They could include processes like fire or connectivity. And importantly, we can also look at attributes around target and how things connect to traditional knowledge. When we're selecting attributes, what we really want teams to do is pick things that are really important for long-term health. So when in doubt, you want to pick things that can be or are likely to be affected by human activities, and look for a small number of them. So you don't want to have lots and lots of sort of desirable or descriptive characteristics, because what we're going to do is to really think about, for each of these attributes, picking an indicator, and that should be an indicator that we intend to measure. So you're starting to create some work for yourself as you select these attributes. For each target, we're really thinking about 2, 3, 4, maximum of 5 attributes, not too many. So we'll just go through an example. So in this case, if we've got a target of traditional knowledge, some of the attributes might be the use of the knowledge or the passing on of the knowledge. Step 2 is about selecting indicators. So indicators are the measurable part of the attribute that tell us about its status or health. So if we think about a key attribute of a human is the circulatory system, the bit that sends you blood around your body, an indicator might be the blood pressure. So the indicator is what you measure. It's pretty hard to measure your circulatory system, even though that's very important for your health, but it's very easy to measure your blood pressure. When we're looking for indicators, it's important to think about indicators that community members will be comfortable using and familiar with. So that might be things like the fat on the tail of a kangaroo, how the kangaroo meat tastes, or knowledge of stories about the kangaroo if you're thinking about something in, say, Northern Australia. What we're looking for are indicators that are really strongly related to the health of the attribute, that are efficient and affordable to measure. So you don't want to sort of go down the track of setting up really complicated indicators that need lots of replication and specialist knowledge if that's not going to be available at the park. You need something that people are going to be able to measure. Desirable indicators also are the sorts of things that might give you a good early warning to serious threats. And it's also great if you can find an indicator that might help you assess 2 or more attributes. So good indicators should meet the following criteria. It needs to be measurable. You need to be able to record something and then analyse it. It needs to be precise. So it needs to be defined the same way by all people. It needs to be consistent so that you can compare the measurements you've made at different times. It needs to be sensitive, so you need to actually measure something that will change in response to changes to threats or changes to health. And we touched on this in the last slide, but it has to be sustainable. You have to be able to use it with the resources you have. So if we go back to thinking about the traditional knowledge target and the attributes of use of knowledge and passing on of knowledge, an indicator that you might be able to use to measure both use and whether it's being passed on might be something like elder satisfaction. Step 3 is coming up with a bit of a ranking system for your target health. So that means for each of the attributes or indicators, you're thinking about what does very good look like. So this needs very little intervention. It's pretty healthy and it's able to sort of look after itself. Good basically means you've got a sort of acceptable. It's in pretty good health. You're pretty happy when it's good. You might need a little bit of intervention to keep it healthy. Fair means it actually is outside what we call its acceptable range of variation. So it requires help. And poor means restoration might be pretty difficult. It may result in extinction. And if we thought about these in a sort of human context, very good is, very fit and healthy human. Doesn't need to particularly go and visit the doctor. Good means needs to go and get perhaps some checkups and do some things, but is managing very well, no major problems. Fair means there are some problems. You're not critical, but you might need some fairly intensive help. You might need to even go into the hospital and get some help. I think when we're getting to the poor stage, when you think about sort of what constitutes poor health, you really sort of, the analogy would be this target's in the emergency room. The indicators are telling you it's in really poor health. So it's in a fair bit of trouble. So if we'll have a little bit of a look at an example again. So if we're looking at traditional knowledge, we've got the attribute being use of that knowledge. The indicator is the percent of elders satisfied traditional knowledge is being used. So something like very good might be greater than 80% of elders are satisfied. Good, say 65 to 80% of elders are satisfied. Fair, 50 to 60. And poor might be very few, less than 50% of the elders are happy. And what we want to do then when we're looking at each of our targets is think about where are we now? So we're looking at what we call the current status. So in this case, this group has said at the moment there's not sort of widespread satisfaction. So only 50 to 60% of elders are satisfied that their traditional knowledge is being used. This allows us for each of the targets to come up with a bit of a scorecard, a health scorecard. So we can really have a look and see how are each of our targets doing, and we've got those listed down the left-hand side. So law and culture, right way fire, the rock art, etc. And then we've given them a score to say, how's their health doing? So you can see that particularly in this example, sort of the landscape and seascape health is doing fairly well. The cultural health, people are pretty worried about that. The kind of condition and the size criteria are broadly pretty good, a couple of fares there. So overall health, you can see on the end here, the ones that people are most worried about are the rock art, the cultural places, then culture and law, and right way fire. So that really helps this group, the Warrnambool people, think about where do they want to put their effort, where do they need to put their time. So when we're thinking about this, we've already got information about targets. These are called values in the MET, condition and trend for most protected areas, which has been done through the PNG MET process. So management planning can look at this again in a little bit more detail with more people in the workshops, perhaps including some scientists. So here we've got an example of a summary table from the MET showing targets, condition and trend. And here's another example from Lake Katubu. So here, again, you could see pretty quickly looking at this scorecard that the fish and culture and tradition are the ones which probably need the most urgent attention, in that freshwater animals and plants are broadly in much better health. This relates to the draft goals in that case study, where they've set a goal that by 2030 all 12 species of endemic fish can be found in the lake, and that by 2030 the big fish, over 20 centimetres, have returned and can be used for family food. So setting those target health ratings and assigning them really helps us think about where do we want to focus, but it also helps us think about our goals. When we're doing this, one thing we need to be aware of is we can work with a flexible level of detail. So this is an example where people were thinking about a target that was a grassland with an attribute that was the fire regime, an indicator that was the fire frequency. And when they thought about it first, they were really able to say fair is not enough fire and say it's in fair. They went away and talked to some more people and came up with their second one, where they said, okay, fair is a fire frequency of greater than 10 years, and good would be a fire frequency of between 5 and 10 years. After a bit more consultation and more discussion, they came up with the attribute where they said, okay, we've switched our indicator, so we've actually made it the percent of grassland with a 5 to 10 year fire return. So you can see they've built on their second pass, and then they've actually said poor would be less than 25% has that fire return interval, whereas good would be 50 to 75% has that fire return interval. So the project team can use any one of these and change over time. What we're really interested in is capturing the current state of knowledge. So as you're doing this, we really encourage you, don't worry too much about information gaps. You don't need to focus on filling out all of the indicator ratings, because we can return during later planning stages to add more detail if that's needed. And it really helps us, once you've worked out that you've got an information gap, that helps you decide whether you need to fill it or not. So it's a little bit of getting you to think, okay, we need to accept some uncertainty in this because we need to keep moving. So do your best job and then see how you go. So we often find when we're doing this sort of description, our teams will come up with a sheet like this. So they might be able to fill out a couple of the attributes columns pretty well, and then on others they might just indicate pictorially a bit of a range. So goals. We've covered a fair bit in this presentation, but we thought it would be useful just to talk to you a little bit about how we set goals, because it's very strongly related to this step around determining health. So in this case, we're actually moving on to just think a little bit forward into that second step of planning. So we do this, the reason for doing goals is goals really help you shift to solution-focused thinking. And the job, in terms of this process, is to try and get the colours in the health tables from red and yellow to green. And that's often a life journey. Sometimes these things can be pretty big to do. So if we're thinking about a goal to improve health, this is the example from before, from Warrnambool-Gumbra. And we had the issue of poor cultural health for cultural places on islands and fish and, oh no, it's rock art and cultural places on islands. And so in their first cut of the plan, they actually set a goal to say by 2014 we'll be looking after important cultural sites according to Wandjina law, and by 2020 all culturally important sites will be looked after this way. So they used this table and sort of seeing what needed the most help to really set what is it we need to do. So some helpful hints for goals. All of them should be SMART, and you should be, I think, familiar with SMART: specific, measurable, agreed upon, realistic and time bound, which are also included in your protected area guidelines. The other thing to note is that a lot of people talk about goals throughout the process. So it's very useful, even in the beginning parts of the process, to have in your mind starting to think about what your goals might be and capturing them as you go along. Final tip, developing SMART goals in a big group can be quite difficult, so you might want to get close and tidy them up later. We'll now pause the presentation and you get a chance to ask Stuart and I any clarifying questions on the presentation.